Hello, everybody. I'm Judith Smith. I'm really happy to be here. I'm talking to you from New York States. I am a professor at Fordham, a researcher interested in aging. I've just written a book on mothering in later life called Difficult: Mothering Adult Children Through Conflict and Change. And I'm now going to present my work with you. Okay, so in terms of using your conceptualization, who the affected family member is, in my case, I was interested in older mothers. And I started with a qualitative study, and I recruited older women who self-identified as having an adult children who was having serious problems. You know, these are children who are 30, 40, 50 years old, and the moms were all over 60. So I didn't specify that I was looking for moms of adult kids who had addiction problems or serious mental illness. Instead, as a qualitative researcher, I wanted to find out from women themselves what were the issues in their adult children's lives that gave them concern. So the way I sort of got into being curious and wanting to study older women and their adult children was really from the data I was aware of in the elder abuse field, and how most victims of elder abuse were older women, and that the most common perpetrator was a dependent adult child with mental illness or substance abuse issues, and often dependent adult children living with their parents put the parent at the greatest risk for elder abuse. And simultaneously, the data on so many young people moving back home, never leaving home, and failing to launch. So I decided I wanted to understand. I had spent years as a child developmental researcher, and I wanted to now know what's going on here in later life, that there is this increasing social problem of elder abuse, and adult kids are hurting their mothers, and these mothers are not calling for help or reporting the problem. I found there was very little in the professional literature about mothering in later life, and really nothing in the self-help literature that in terms of parenting, it's as if parenting ends when kids are 18 or 19 and they're launched. But I did find finally the work of Carl Pillemer and his group, the Intergenerational Ambivalence framework, which became the anchor for my research. So the Intergenerational Ambivalence framework really talks about that inherent in certain roles, like being a parent, are expectable feelings of ambivalence. It's not like there's some families who have ambivalence and other families who don't have ambivalence. That every parent experiences some ambivalence because the role of being a parent of an adult child has a conflicting mandate. That on the one hand, we're supposed to launch our kids to be independent, and simultaneously, we're supposed to be there when they're in need. So even though every parent experiences some ambivalence, because you can't do both of these at the same time, some families have higher ambivalence, and that's what Pillemer and his group have studied. And they found that when kids were, off time in their developments, like not getting married when it was expected, not completing school, and having mental health and substance use problems, the parents' ambivalence increased. Within the intergenerational ambivalence model, there are two different kinds of ambivalence. There's psychological ambivalence, which is one that you may be more familiar with, coming from Freud, where we have mixed or contradictory feelings towards the same person. But structural ambivalence is different. Structural ambivalence comes out of when there are these contradictory expectations within a particular role. So that certain roles, like being a parent, don't have clear guidelines. And same with being a woman, being a parent. What is a good parent? What is a successful woman? On the one hand, we're supposed to be there for our kids. On the other hand, we're supposed to work and help contribute to the family. So my work over the last 8 years has been using the intergenerational ambivalence model to study the lived experiences of adult children from poor and non-poor mothers whose kids had serious problems. So I looked across the problems in the adult child and discovered the commonalities that affect older mothers. I also was informed by Glenn Elder's work and the life course concept of linked lives, that if children are off time in their development, parents experience ambivalence and depression. Most culture, I think every culture has an unexpressed social clock that everybody is aware of when kids are supposed to complete their education, when they're supposed to move out of the house, when they're supposed to marry, and when they're supposed to be financially independent. And if your child is not on that trajectory, parents feel badly. We have a phrase in the US that parents are only as happy as their least unhappy child. So the idea that even if your kids, you have one child who's succeeding really well, but you have another son who's unemployed, has severe mental illness, that kid is what makes you feel bad. And Karen Fingerman and her group actually were able to statistically show that the positive rewards from the succeeding kid does not undo the negative feelings about the kid who's off track and failing. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details about my sample. I'd be glad to send you copies of my research. But basically, I specifically recruited first poor women. And then I did a second wave of research with non-poor women. And my sample ended up being including at least a little bit, 60% people who are minorities. So overall, what I was discovering is that what mothers were upset about in terms of things that bother them is when their kids had delayed self-sufficiency and returned to them or the family for residential, emotional, or financial support. So I think you may have similar groups in Europe, NEETs, Ninnies in Spain, Hikikomori in Japan. So what I found, I started with this open-ended question about how does this impact the mothers. The things that they were concerned about were substances, and interestingly, it was sort of equal among poor and non-poor. Cleanliness in the home, because most of the moms allowed the kids to move back in when they couldn't be self-supporting. This was reported more by poor women. Aggressive to others. Mental health issues were similar across income groups, and different kinds of boundary crossings, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the way that the mothers talked about it was the things that bothered them when their kid was disrespectful to her, when the kid was aggressive to others and to the mother herself. And interestingly, even though many of these women were recruited in elder abuse services, none of the women ever called themselves elder abuse victims. The mothers talked about their upset that their kids weren't succeeding in life. They were chosen the wrong partner. They weren't good parents. And only 2 of everyone I talked to saw their kids' problems as temporary, that they would be resolved once the child got immigration papers or once they were rehired at their previous employment. So what did I find about how adult children's problems affect their moms? Well, first of all, the whole context for this was co-residence, except for the more affluent women. The more affluent women could afford to buy a separate apartment for their adult child who had serious mental illness, for example, so they were not impacted daily. But overall, when the adult child was back home living with them, I created a theme called boundary crossing, where the mothers felt invaded by the adult child being there. The kid was not following the mother's rules, taking the mother's food, money. And then there was actual physical abuse, which is obviously a boundary crossing, of verbal abuse, One case was sexual abuse and attempted eviction, where the adult child was trying to get the mom evicted from her own home. And many of the women talked about what I called role violation, that the mothers expected that they should be treated with gratitude, with respect, and there was not reciprocity when these children were living in the house. They weren't doing their share of taking care of the house, etc. So again, the model of intergenerational ambivalence talks about psychological ambivalence and structural. Interestingly, I had hardly any reports that I could analyze as psychological ambivalence or mixed feelings towards one's kid. Hardly any women talked about positive feelings about their adult child, even though I asked for high points and low points in relationship. One woman said, I love her, but I resent her at the same time. Does that make any sense? I resent this burden that I have to bear. So even though she's saying she has mixed feelings, it's all within the context of her role as her mother and her caregiver. So I found that for mothers in later life, women in later life, the role of being a mother is what housed all of their ambivalence. That mothers were prioritizing their child's needs above their own with the rationale that I'm the mother. A good mother does not put her own needs before her children's. If your child is being abusive, if you kick out your child, then you're being selfish and a heartless mother. And to go on with your life when your adult child is struggling is too painful as a caring mother. So the underlying theme was, I can't walk away. I am the mother. And each person in her own way was struggling with whose needs should take priority. I'm at a crossroads. I cannot keep leaving myself out, but do you just throw them away? It's her or me. I have to move away, but she won't survive without me. I'm trapped in this relationship. And the second overriding communication was, if not me, who? Who is going to take care of my adult child who has mental illness, substance abuse, will not work if I don't? So this ambivalence about wanting to be a good mother interferes with the woman's ability to prioritize her own needs. So to take action to remove her abusive adult child felt impossible to many, although many did. And when you read my articles, I'll talk more about that. But the overall, I cannot evict my child. I am not cold-hearted. And I think that this is very frustrating for caseworkers and therapists who are working with mothers with difficult or abusive adult children, because you can make a safety plan with them and they will not follow through. And I think agencies where I have done trainings and helping the clinicians to begin to see the women's resistance to following the plan as instead ambivalence and their wish to be a good mother helps many, particularly beginning workers, make sense of what's going on. Because otherwise it feels crazy. Why isn't this woman protecting herself? And I think the other idea of, if not me, who, is in some ways an accurate question. You know, who, if these mothers feel like they have to be the safety net for their vulnerable children, is that true? What is the safety net in each of your countries? In my country, mothers are still expected to remain the primary safety net for vulnerable family members. Psychiatric hospitals have closed. Community mental health never happened. Affordable substance treatment is not available, for many. So overall, I want to sum up that I hope you will consider the utility in using Pillemer and Lucia's intergenerational ambivalence model for studying parents' experience of how their kids' problems impact them. And side by side is women's, mothers' internalized mandate to be a good mother And this really frames her ability to take action, even if it's the most wise and safest. And understanding mothers' difficulties in taking action to protect themselves as ambivalence rather than enabling can inform the helping process. So I welcome your questions, and I'd really like to know how this model works for you and how you understand it from your cultural lens.